Welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the coil and the air shock on the Kenevo. So the Kenevo that I have is the version 2 of the Kenevo. It is a 2021 spec. So the 2020 Kenevo was designed around a coil shock. That is how Specialized intended it to be used. It was designed for kind of rowdy, gnarly terrain, and that's where a coil shock is most suited. So yeah, left the factory with a coil shock, but quite quickly after they started selling the first models, I believe, people were finding that they were blowing through the travel. So Specialized decided that it was time for them to put the air shock on the 2021 models, and this is the shock that came with mine, and that is a Fox DPX2 Performance. I'll give you a bit of history on my bike. The bike turned up in January 2021, and the first ride I went out on the bike and just did a very casual XC ride, kind of just getting a feel for the bike, getting used to it. Took it out for the second ride, cycled through the suspension a couple of times, and I thought, this is strange, it's making a funny noise. And the more I looked into it, the more I was convinced that the rear shock was making excessive noise and not a noise that you'd expect from a shock. And yeah, decided I wasn't happy with it, took the shock off and sent it back to the Specialized store in Chester, and they would then inspect it, and then they sent it off for warranty. So yeah, after one ride the shock had basically blown up. Now I do believe that Fox had a lot of quality control issues last year, maybe leading into this year, which hopefully are fixed now, and hopefully all the Fox products, which are a premium brand and a premium product demanding a premium price, hopefully they're all fixed and they're all good. But I would say it's definitely put a dent in the reputation of Fox. Bit rubbish, but anyway, at the same time I just happened to look on eBay and found the exact size coil shock that I needed. So the coil shock is a Rockshox. The Rockshox coil shock that came on the expert model of the Kenevo. It came with a £500 spring, and once fitted to the Kenevo I realised it bottomed out super easy. So opted for the next spring rate up, which is £550, and again bottomed it out relatively easily. So after this I moved to a MRP progressive coil spring. So if you're not aware, coil springs, regardless of where they are in the travel, they have the same amount of force to compress them. Basically, it's a linear, coil shocks are linear, but obviously with a progressive spring it ramps up. So starts off at £550, ramping up to 600 or something. So yeah, a lot more progressive, and it did improve the ride a lot. However, still easily bottomed out, I found, which is not ideal basically. So anyway, after about a month I think, the air shock came back, and eventually I switched over because I was enjoying the coil shock, but I decided I needed to try out the air shock. So I bolted the air shock back on, and I was like, wow, actually the air shock is really good and really suits the bike. And that's what I basically ran ever since, up until recently when I decided it was probably time to do a back-to-back comparison of the coil and the air, and to see which one I prefer, and then that way I can sell the one that I'm not using, because it's pointless having two shocks. So I went to my local country park, my local trails that I'm familiar with. Not the most rowdiest of trails, not the most demanding of trails. Also, disclaimer, I'm not a professional rider, I'm not a professional bike suspension expert. This is just about my experience and basically the feedback that I got from the bike doing back-to-back testing. So I did some runs and kind of a lap on the coil shock and the air shock. I started off with the air shock as that was what was fitted to the bike, and then I went back to the van, swapped from the air shock to the coil shock, and went out on exactly the same runs, did exactly the same lap to get the feedback from the bike. And my First impressions were that the air shock felt a lot more supple and kind of gave you that small bump kind of sensitivity. It felt like it really was quite squishy in the first part of the travel, and that the tyre would ride over all the bumps and basically soak up the bumps, all of the small bumps. It was also a lot harder to bottom out. I don't think I bottom out the air shock. The Coil, on the other hand, felt like it was a lot firmer. It generally didn't have that small bump suppleness that you expect from a Coil shock. That is the main reason why people switch to a Coil. They want the small bump sensitivity, and the other factor is that a Coil shock won't heat up over time. So if you're doing a really long trail ride, it should stay consistent, whereas as the air shock heats up, the characteristics of the shock can change. To an amateur rider like me, whether you'll notice that, probably not. More focused on staying on the bike and not dying. But still, it's something to factor in, especially if you're racing. But anyway, yeah, going back to the air shock versus the Coil. The air shock felt like it rode like it was deeper in the travel. Kind of felt like I was in that kind of mid-travel, mid to 3/4 most of the time. But again, couldn't bottom it out, and yeah, the small bump was really good. Switching to the Coil felt super firm, and yeah, probably a little bit too firm. It felt faster and I felt more confident on the bike, and it also felt like it rode higher in the travel. However, it did bottom out, and quite a few times, as well as not having the small bump kind of plush sensitivity that you expect from a Coil. Do I prefer one over the other? Yes, I would say I prefer the air shock. I think air shocks have come a long way. They're really versatile, so if I was to give my bike to someone else with a lighter weight or a heavier weight, you can adjust the air pressure, you can change the settings quite easily, you can take tokens out, put tokens in. Yeah, with a Coil you really need a separate spring, or separate springs, multiple springs to adjust to rider weight differences. And obviously there's the fact that the Coil spring is a lot heavier. So in this case, the Coil spring is over twice the weight of the air shock. So that's quite a penalty to have in terms of weight. Now I know this is a heavy bike. The Kenevo being around 24 kilos is, you know, half a kilo here or there is not going to make too much difference, especially as it's an e-bike. However, it is something to factor in, because all these bits of extra weight here and there can add up. Downhill tyres, Coil shock, larger brake rotors, not having carbon parts on the bike, tubes over tubeless, all these bits can add up to probably a couple of kilos in total. So that would make a big difference on a lighter weight bike. So yeah, in this case it doesn't really matter, but my preference is the air shock. The Coil felt better in terms of the way it rode. I did feel like I had more confidence in it and I could ride faster, but again, is that because I did back-to-back runs and I was getting more confident on the bike as I was warming up? Potentially, so there is that to factor in. So if you've got a 2020 or 2021 Kenevo and you're curious about running a Coil shock or an air shock, depending on which you've got, the air shock I definitely recommend. The Coil, I just can't recommend it. The suspension design seems to be super linear on the back, and it just seems to blow through the travel. So with an air shock, obviously you can get that ramp up, that progression, and that's what you need. I just can't recommend the Coil. Obviously each to their own and everyone's different. However, even with a progressive spring, I just couldn't get it to not bottom out all the time. Now obviously I know you want to be able to use all of your suspension, and bottoming out a couple of times every ride is supposed to be the optimum suspension setup, but not on some of the easier stuff. You shouldn't be bottoming out going off a tiny little drop, in my opinion. Now I've just been on the Specialized concept store, and it appears that the Kenevo is hanging around for a little bit longer. So the 2022 model, although it's got different components on it, slightly different spec and a new motor, the suspension and frame design appears to be exactly the same. So if you're ordering one of these, which is a great bike by the way, highly recommend it, but you'll have an air shock with it. If you're thinking of going for a coil, obviously take on board what I've just said. In my experience, the air shock is really well suited, and obviously Specialized agree because that's why they spec it with an air shock now. Hopefully this video has been of some use to you if you've owned a Kenevo or own a Kenevo or are looking to purchase a Kenevo. It's a great bike, it's a great climber, great descender, and a good full fat e-bike basically. The new model looks really good. It's got a revised motor, bigger front disc rotor, and some other component changes. Not sure on the colours, a little bit kind of Marmite with the greens, but that's obviously personal preference. I'm probably not going to switch to the coil again. I'm going to put the air shock back on and sell the coil. I just don't think that I'm going to use it. It's just not usable for me with it bottoming out so easily. If I went to a stiffer spring, I just don't think I'd have the small bump compliance and the plushness that I kind of expect and want, and also it's a weight penalty as well. But yeah, loving Kenevo. I'm going to continue riding it with the air shock and yeah, continue putting the miles in. Hopefully this video has been of use to you, and I'll see you in the next video.